Mr. Anthony Tucker Jones, welcome to my channel. I would like to talk about history. Why history is so important?
Um, I think, well, the thing with studying history, it's important trying to learn from our mistakes in the past. I mean, unfortunately, being a historian, you tend to realize quite quickly learn from the past ones. Sadly, um, but I think with history is important because it tells us how we've got where we are and why. I mean, I think that's the key thing.
Can we learn from history for the future?
Um, I I think so. I mean, to use an American expression, it does sometimes feel a bit like Groundhog Day. So, the current situation in Europe, all this talk of a second Cold War, it kind of feels a bit like we've been there before. But I think we can, because things like NATO have been good for Europe. We have avoided a major global conflict since 1945. So I like to think we do learn our lessons. A key one, of course, is we've just had the anniversary of Hiroshima, and thank heavens, nobody has ever resorted to using nuclear weapons again. We've learned our lessons, and hopefully, we abide by them.
Let me introduce to the audience. In fact, I have that. Anthony Thacker Jones, you were born in 1964. You are a former defense intelligence officer. It's like, sorry, a James Bond or something like that.
Sorry, repeat the question for me.
No, I mean, you are a former intelligence officer, so you became from the army.
No, I was a civilian, but my background in that, I think, made me ideally suited to being a historian because, of course, it hones your analytical skills. It makes you a good researcher. I think it makes you question sources. I mean, one of the joys of being a historian, of course, is that all the detective work that's involved in piecing together a story. Particularly when I'm writing a book, um, the thing that I enjoy from all the sources you consult. And again, being a historian, actually, it's quite an honor. You're constantly having to be on the guard that you're not misrepresenting what happened, or you're not steering people in the wrong direction.
When did you decide to become a historian?
I mean, I think like lots of people, I've been interested in history since I was at school. Um, and growing up, like lots of people, I was into things like wargaming, toy soldiers. I'm a child of the 60s, so I grew up with 1960s Hollywood movies, and inevitably they sort of ingrain themselves on a young lad's psyche. And also, my father was in the army, and I was born in a military hospital, so it's almost as if military history is woven into my DNA, if you like. So I think the most.
There are a lot of British historians that became from the army or from the journalism. For example, from the army, Anthony Beevor, or from journalism, Matt Hastings, Andrew Roberts.
Yeah.
Why?
Um, a lot of military officers go into military history, again, for obvious reasons, because normally when they do their staff courses, there's an element of military history involved in their instruction. And I think probably for them, it feels like a natural progression. I'm not quite so sure what the appeal is with journalists. I think on the whole, what they tend to be is they'll have been a foreign correspondent or a war correspondent in the past. And I suppose that then is a natural progression, to going into military history. I mean, you cited Max Hastings there, and of course he was for many years a war correspondent. And again, his father was in the army, or actually his father was. For those sorts of backgrounds, I think they naturally lead into military history.
Do you feel historian or do you feel military historian?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think in light of the books I've written, I'm really a military historian. the military side of history is what interests me. Not to say I'm not interested in broader history, but my sort of focus does tend to be, battles, campaigns, generals, commanders, that sort of thing.
How many books have you written? Some of them.
Um, as I always say to people, it's an embarrassingly large number. At the last count, it was about 70 or so. Um,
Mhm.
I'm very prolific. I'm also very fortunate in that publishers want to work with me, and that's a nice place to be in your career. I'm regularly offered projects. I sometimes initiate projects as well, but it's a nice position to be, to do it full time. I mean, lots of historians have day jobs. There'll be university lecturers, or like you just said, reporters or journalists. But I am in that fortunate position that I do it full time now. So it is a job. I mean, I treat it where I can as a 9 to 5 job. I always say to people, the thing about being a writer is it's the tyranny of the word count. That you have to sit. There's none of this looking for inspiration. You have to be very, very disciplined as a writer. As journalists are, you've got to be disciplined because you need to be able to produce a certain amount of words, during a certain period. Because obviously, as a writer, you're under contract from a publisher, and they expect you to deliver a manuscript at the agreed time. So, yeah, I am very, very disciplined as a writer.
Discipline like in the army.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Uh, a lot of concentration. You've got to be very, very focused. And again, I think that's why military history appeals to people from military backgrounds, um, because they have that analytical training, to look at campaigns. But also they have the ability to sit down and wade through a lot of research material and decide what's important, because you have to be your own editor when you're writing a book. You need to be able to decide very quickly what is useful and what is not,
Mhm.
and that takes practice. It's not really a skill people, I think, develop overnight. Certainly, when you're at university, of course, you're taught to do research and what have you. But it's when you're wading through a lot of sources, you've got to be very, very focused on what it is you need to support what you're saying. Otherwise, it's very easy to disappear down research rabbit.
Some of them has been published into another languages. For example, the one
Yes,
in Italian.
yes, that's right. Yes, I've had about probably about a dozen different language translations. So that's quite nice.
You have any book translated into Spanish, just for the Spanish audience, to
Um,
buy the book?
No, not that I'm aware of. I did do a check the other day, because publishers don't always tell you immediately when they've sold the foreign rights. So you're not, sometimes. Uh, for instance, I had one the other day just turn up. I had a book that had been translated in Japanese, which I was unaware of that a Japanese publisher had bought the rights to it. So it turned up on the doorstep, which was a nice surprise. But I was unaware of it. But Spanish, I don't think so. I mean, I'm always open. My publishers are always open to, Spanish publishers approaching them. I do get approached quite regularly by publishers, keen on doing translation copies. Um,
Let's talk about your one of the latest book. That one, Churchill. Well, in fact, two
yeah,
books about Churchill. First
yes.
one,
Churchill Cold War Warrior, that was published last year, and then Churchill Master and Commander came out in 2021. Um, I've always found Churchill completely fascinating because I've written a lot of books on the Second World War, so he always features in those books, but he's never been the sort of focus of the story. I've not written any biographies before, so it was quite a big undertaking to do this. It's not something I've done in the past. So, but the skills are the same. And the first book looked very much at Churchill's early military career, and then what qualified him to be, prime minister in 1940. Um, and I called it Master and Commander because not only was he prime minister, but he also made himself Britain's very first defence minister, which effectively put him in control of Britain's strategic conduct of the Second World War. And then I had one of my contacts in the Churchill Society said, well, Anthony, why did you not follow Churchill, to the end of his career? So that sort of sowed the seeds for the second book. And lots of people don't realise that Churchill was prime minister twice. He was actually prime minister in the 1950s. And as I've just said, I'm very much a child of the Cold War. So I thought it would be quite fascinating to look at what his impact was on the Cold War, what he tried to achieve, what hand he'd had in indeed creating the Cold War, because obviously the Second World War sowed the seeds for it. So what was Churchill's role in permitting the Soviet Union to occupy Eastern Europe? So that's what led to this second volume.
Churchill was the first one to talk about the Cold War, but he was right.
Yes. Things I argue in Churchill Cold War Warrior is that he did sow the seeds for the Cold War, because when he met Stalin in Moscow in October 1944, he produced what's since been called the Naughty document. They had this lovely meal, a few drinks, and I think it was just the pair of them and the translators. And Churchill was very keen on saving Greece and Italy from communism, particularly Greece, because obviously Britain had failed to save it in 1941. So Churchill, sort of in an offhand manner, said to Stalin, he wrote down on this document, why don't we have percentage of interest in Eastern Europe in return for you keeping out of Greece? And of course, that sowed in Stalin's mind that Britain and America would acquiesce to him occupying Eastern Europe to create a security buffer, to protect the Soviet Union from a potential Third World War started by a resurgent Germany. So I think, Churchill should never have done, speaking for the pair of them. And in fact, because with the benefit of hindsight, what he should have said was, Britain and America will not tolerate the Red Army remaining in Eastern Europe. And what we want is democratic elections in all the Eastern European countries. But of course, he didn't do that. And that sort of, I think, signaled to Stalin that him staying in Eastern Europe would not necessarily be a major problem at the end of the Second World War.
Churchill was a warmonger, but again, he was right.
He gets called a warmonger. I don't think he is. He was a child of empire, so he'd served in the British Army in Sudan and India and in South Africa. But I don't think he was necessarily a warmonger. I mean, I don't think assuming the role of Prime Minister in 1940 was necessarily something that he fully embraced But I think what made him eminently qualified to do that job was he'd done every single major senior government role prior to 1940. So, he'd been Secretary of State for War, he'd been Secretary of State for Air, he'd been the First Lord of the Admiralty, so he'd been the political head of the Royal Navy, he'd been Minister for Munitions, he'd been the Colonial Secretary. So he'd done all these jobs, which gave him a very good feel for the British Empire and the feel for its military responsibilities. And also, crucially, of course, a really good handle on what Britain's military capabilities were when it came to fighting, another global war, bearing in mind, of course, Europe had already suffered through the First World War.
What was the secret of Churchill? I mean, he was out of politics more or less for 10 years.
I think whether you agree with his politics or not, I think the thing that fascinates most people is his sheer zest for life. When you look at what Churchill achieved, you kind of feel you've been wasting your time. I mean, the man was a complete polymath. He seemed to have limitless energy. He was a soldier, a journalist, an author, a novelist, politician, a bricklayer, kind of you name it, he had a go at it. And also incredibly well travelled. So he travelled around the world a lot. So had I think a good world feel. And also he always got up whenever he was knocked back, particularly in his political career. He would always dust himself off and carry on. Never once did he consider, seriously at least, renouncing his political career. I mean, It's like at the end of the Second World War, you kind of think, why didn't he retire? He could have gone, stayed with his wealthy friends abroad. He'd been commissioned to write the history of the Second World War. He didn't really need to stay in politics. Or I think he had a point to prove, because it's important to remember in 1940, he was an emergency appointment. He was not elected as prime minister. He was an emergency wartime appointment. And after he lost the general election in 1945, I think he was deep down determined to prove that he could lead the country via the ballot box, by being elected in. That was that, and I think that's what, particularly post-war, that's what drove him. And also, of course, he's a prototype spin doctor. He was the ultimate marketing man, ultimate public relations man. And he managed himself. I mean, as we all know, he created the Churchill myth. I mean, lots of people since have added to it. I guess I'm probably slightly guilty of it as well. But Churchill molded that public image, by the way he dressed, by the way he spoke, by his. He sort of molded how the people perceived him. And also, of course, he molded how history saw him by writing, history books. He wrote a history of the First World War, and then he wrote a history of the Second World War, both of which, of course, pretty much put him center stage. So he managed, while he was alive, he managed his own legacy. Very, very effective. And then I think that's, again, something you've got to quite admire in the man.
Why Churchill won the war and lost the elections?
Well, he won the war because he made a couple of key decisions that kept Britain in the fight. And I think key amongst those in 1940 was the decision to conduct Dunkirk. So he saved the British Expeditionary Force and the bulk of the British Army so it could fight again. Initially, when he authorised Operation Dynamo, as Dunkirk was officially known, and when he authorised that, he didn't tell the French because he didn't want them to know that we were abandoning them. Obviously, he didn't want them to give up the fight because obviously they're helping with the rear guard. So it was a very, very painful decision for him. And then the other thing I think he did very decisively was that he did not bow down to the Battle of Britain or the Blitz. When the Luftwaffe tried to beat Britain into submission. I'm firmly of the view that Hitler never had any intention of invading the British Isles. He hoped he could cow Britain by bombing it and overwhelming the RAF. There's a school of thought that goes, well, to invade, he needed to overwhelm the RAF to get air supremacy. But I think because effectively what he had was the Blitz without the Krieg, the famous German Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. So he had the lightning, but he didn't have the war. So he waged a blitz on Britain, but I don't think his eye was set on the Soviet Union. He wanted to invade Russia. Invading Britain didn't serve anyone other than probably Japan, because it would mean the British Empire would be left afloat, without firm government, unless the British government escaped to Canada. So I think those are the key things he did. And then also, of course, fundamentally vital to the Allied war effort was he brought Roosevelt on side before America even entered the war. Fortunately for Churchill, Roosevelt was very pro-British. He liked Churchill. And up until Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt, despite various neutrality acts, which forbade America from entering the war, Roosevelt did everything he could to try and help Britain. And without America, the Second World War would not have been won. Could it have been won just with the Soviet Union? I don't know. If there'd not been that constant threat of a second front in France, Hitler could have transferred more units to the Eastern Front, and perhaps the outcome would. Key things he did to help win the Second World War. In terms of losing the general election, well, he thought because of what he'd done, he would get voted in. But of course, British elections are not presidential. The electorate votes for a political party. It doesn't vote for the prime minister. Um, and after the war, the British public, particularly the armed forces, liked what the Labour Party was saying in terms of, its policies to get Britain back on its feet. And it wasn't keen on what the Conservative Party had to offer. Um, and I think one of the things that swung the vote was lots of, British service personnel going, do you know what, particularly those overseas, when we get home, we want change. And I think Labour's maybe offering that. Because famously, I think it was the British public thought they were voting for Churchill but got Labour. That they liked him as a war leader, but they didn't like what Conservatives had to offer in terms of its policies post-war. And to be fair, I mean, some historians argue that Labour government of 1945 to 50 was probably about the best one we've ever had, because it laid the foundations of the British welfare state. It laid the foundations for the National Health Service. It did a pretty good job. The problem was, of course, Britain was bankrupt and it still had lots of wars abroad, so it lost in popularity come the early 1950s. And I think Churchill personally, I mean, he put a brave face on it, but when he lost the general election in July 1945, it was a heavy blow to him. I mean, because he'd done everything to make a good job, or at least trying to make a good job of leading the country during the Second World War. And unlike, say, Hitler or Stalin, Churchill had travelled up and down, the British Isles to see bomb damage, to see the public. He travelled extensively to the battlefront. I mean, the generals despaired of him, trying to stop him going to France or Italy, because the call of the drums called him. He wanted to go and see the action. And likewise, of course, he did all that shuttle diplomacy with international leaders, including Roosevelt, famously in the Crimea, at Yalta, obviously in North Africa, in Algiers and Morocco and what have you. So he put himself about, if you like. He was incredibly active. I mean, arguably he shouldn't have done it, because he was putting himself at risk every time he did it. But he was very much a leader who wanted to lead at the front. And again, I think that's one of the things that people find appealing about him, is that he didn't shy away of getting in harm's way, which even as an old man he did on a regular basis. Turning up at front lines in Afghanistan or somewhere, in the recent wars, or Iraq, the media would have a meltdown, that's irresponsible and dangerous. Whereas Churchill sort of revelled in that, being in France or in Germany or Italy, to go and view the fighting, to see what was happening. So that was a good trait of his. It was that sort of leadership by example and leadership from the front.
Mr. Tucker Jones, we have been talking for more than 20 minutes, but we have been talking only for about two of your books. So we have another one here. Let me see. The Fall of Berlin. How could happen? I mean, not the fall of Berlin, the Third Reich, of course.
How did the fall of Berlin happen?
Well, how could have happened the Third Reich?
Like arose from the ashes of Germany during the First World War. I always say to people, it's important to remember that Adolf Hitler was a dictator, but actually the German public voted him into office. I mean, he won an election, so he got there by democratic means. What he did afterwards, of course, was turn Germany into this sort of hideous police state. Waged global war. Conducted the final solution and all the other horrors of the Second World War. But in terms of Berlin, I mean, the problem Hitler always had was that the Allies insisted on unconditional surrender, and the Germans simply didn't want to do that, because they knew if they surrendered unconditionally, it would mean the occupation of Germany. There was no honourable, armistice. They would have to lay down their arms, their armed forces would be disbanded. And in a way, of course, that drove Germany and indeed Japan to the whole thing should have been brought to a negotiated end earlier. But of course, the Allies were adamant that Germany must surrender unconditionally. There would be no terms. It couldn't negotiate itself out of the war because the Allies were not prepared to concede it any concessions. In terms of Berlin falling, well, famously the Red Army took it. The Americans could have reached it, but it had been agreed that Berlin was going to be within the Soviet occupation zone in East Germany. And also, I think the Americans felt the casualties would be just too great for them to reach the city. But bizarrely, with the benefit of hindsight, it's really odd that Hitler didn't abandon the city. I mean, clearly he came to the decision that he was going to face the hangman's noose, and it was better that he died by his own hand than being put on trial and executed. But what was, you kind of feel wholly unnecessary. But for Hitler's insistence that they resist to the last, I mean, the Berlin garrison should have surrendered sooner. But everyone, of course, was in thrall of Hitler. They just were not prepared to make any decisions over and above what he was demanding. And of course, that consigned Berlin to this absolutely monumental battle. Ended up surrounded by the Red Army. In fact, it ended up a whole series of battles because Hitler rather hoped that his armies to the north and the south would march to the rescue of the garrison. But of course, they were not in a condition to actually do that. In fact, their biggest desire was to push west to reach the Americans, so they wouldn't have to surrender to the Red Army.
Arnhem Bridge. I don't know how do you say in English. Arnhem or Arnhem?
Arnhem, yes, that's it.
Arnhem.
Yeah.
It was a bridge too far.
By Richard Attenborough, yeah. That particular book, I was inspired to write that by looking at it from the German perspective. Most histories do it from, what happened to the British and the American armies. And I was quite keen to get a better grip on why it was that Germans actually won that battle. For them, it was just one of many battles they were fighting on the Western Front by that point in the war. But of course, ever since, Operation Market Garden sort of reached mythic levels, about why it failed, what would have happened if it had worked, was it a good idea, was it a bad idea? But the one thing that does come out of it is that Field Marshal Montgomery and General Horrocks, who commanded 30 Corps that made the ground attack towards Arnhem, they woefully underestimated the reaction of the German armed forces. They considered not put up much of a fight. And of course, once the Allies were over the bridge at Arnhem over the Rhine, they could make a right hook into the Ruhr, which is the main industrial area of Germany. That would bring their weapons factories to a grinding halt, and it would hasten the end of the war. I mean, they hoped that it would bring the war to the end, end the war by the end of 1944. But that didn't happen. So that particular book looks very closely at the decisions that the Germans made in terms of resisting Operation Market Garden. And the Allies made a whole series of errors that compounded, the defeat. The airborne drops were too far from, particularly Arnhem and Nijmegen. In both instances, the main divisional drops were 25 miles away from the bridge. It's just simply too far. And what were the Germans reacting very quickly? The Germans were able to isolate the British 1st Airborne Advance Guard that had actually got to the bridge. They were able to trap them and then defeat them and prevent help getting to them. And then in the case of Nijmegen, the German garrison there was able to slow down 30 Corps, so the ground forces, for some considerable time, to the point where they simply could not get to Arnhem in a timely manner. And ultimately, 1st Airborne faced either surrendering or being evacuated, and they managed to get the survivors back over the river. But I mean, it's a fascinating battle. I think for staff colleges and things, it's one of those fascinating battles that's full of so many what ifs. It's a classic example of that military adage of the plan never survives contact. Which is why military officers are always taught to have a plan B, plan C, plan D, because there's a good chance plan A will come off the rails very quickly. You've got to be able to think on your, to me being thwarted, what are my alternatives? What am I going to do instead?
Uh, was a failure of General Montgomery? Do you think so?
Um, yes, I think so. I mean, I think way too much is put in stock in him and General Browning ignoring the warnings about German armoured units being in the Arnhem area. I mean, essentially, there were two very, very exhausted panzer divisions in the area that were about to be shipped home to Germany to be re-equipped. And they were able to put together all these ad hoc battle groups, which helped thwart 1st Airborne Division and then the Americans at Nijmegen. But I think the other thing is I think probably the resources allocated to the operation were not big enough. That was part of the problem, that they should have had quite big operations on the flanks, which would have distracted the Germans and stopped them from sending reinforcements to the Arnhem area. But General Browning, who was in command of the airborne element of the operation, and Horrocks, they assumed that the Germans would not get their act together, that they would get to Arnhem against fairly weak units, which would not put up much fight. And that did not prove to be the case. Now, really, Montgomery should have learned his lesson from the Normandy campaign, following D-Day, because the Germans there have been very, very good at deploying Kampfgruppen and, battle groups that were made up of disparate units, quite often rear echelon troops, so typists, Clark, signalmen, and they would fight as infantry and do really well. They'd be quite effective. So I think Montgomery, this is with the benefit of hindsight, Montgomery should really have been alert to that danger. He took a gamble and unfortunately it just didn't work.
Let's talk about that one. How important was spies, lies, and secret services in the World War II?
It is a book about the war behind the front lines. It's not just about agents. It's about guerrilla warfare. It's about eavesdropping operations. Most famously Bletchley Park. With the cracking of Enigma. But the Germans also had radio interception units. That tried to do the same thing to the Allies. The Americans were also doing it against the Japanese in the Far East. So there was a lot of sort of radio signal interception going on, trying to fathom out what the other side was doing. You've obviously got the secret agent element, being sent into the occupied territories to spy. Famously, Britain ran what was called the Double Cross or Double X program, which Britain was highly successful in catching Nazi agents dropped into the British Isles. And a lot of those that were captured were turned. They then started working German intelligence, a lot of fake news, if you like, that had been planted with what they thought were their agents, but actually they had been captured and basically told, it will go better for you if you help us, or otherwise you spend the rest of the war in prison. So that was highly successful. Bletchley Park, of course, in the decades since, it's emerged just how vital that was in tipping off the Allies about Axis activity. And then there was also, massive guerrilla war behind the lines, both, again, in the Far East against the Japanese and the occupied territories in Europe. So it covers all those various aspects of the war. It covers all the intelligence organizations. There were a huge number of different and competing intelligence organizations, both amongst the Allies and amongst the Axis.
The Eastern Front was terrible.
You're clearly going to go through every book I've ever had published. Yes, that book is a collection of absolutely fabulous color photos, Kodak color. So they're not colorized images. I mean, that's important to stress. They are. It was color film that was used at the time. And the images come from this collection called Pick Past. It's run by a chap called Ian Spring, who spent his life collecting wartime colour negatives, particularly German ones. And I've done two books with him, that one on the Eastern Front and one on North Africa. And it's this, because I think most of us tend to think of the Second World War in terms of black and white images. On the whole, the newsreel we used to see, and most books, they use black and white images. So seeing it in colour makes it so much more immediate. I mean, it makes it feel much more recent. And yes, you're right. Eastern Front, the fighting there was of a much more, it was, say, on the Western Front or, in Italy. The rule of law broke down quite seriously on the Eastern Front. The number of atrocities that were committed, and obviously, famously, Stalingrad and Leningrad and other Soviet cities were, devastated by the fighting. I always find it fascinating that Stalin took the decision to hold on to his cities. He famously refused to evacuate Moscow, and they managed to drive the German armed forces away, in the winter of 1942. Famously refused to relinquish Leningrad, so he held on to that. And then likewise in the south, he held on to Stalingrad. So holding those cities sort of skewed it thwarted German strategy, because of course they had to try and take those cities, and that resulted in Hitler, dissipating his resources. Logically, he should have concentrated all his effort on taking Berlin. On Moscow. But instead, he got sidetracked by Leningrad and Stalingrad, and also ridiculously Baku down in the Caucasus, because he convinced himself he needed to capture the Soviet Union's oil fields down in the Caucasus. So the Eastern Front was absolutely enormous. I mean, it extended, I can't remember what the length was. It went from 1,000 miles to about 3,000 miles or something. I'm going from memory here, but the sheer size of the actual Eastern Front was enormous. And it got to a point where really it wasn't a fixed front line as such. It was very, very fluid all the time.
And from the Eastern Front to Africa, Africa Corps.
Absolutely a wonderful selection of colour photographs from North Africa. And what I liked about that was it includes weird and wonderful things like Libyan colonial troops. There's lots of photos of the locals. I mean, you don't think of the Germans doing sightseeing while there's a war on, but actually they toured around Carthage and, lots of other Roman ruins, all sorts of things. Lots of the Germans, when they were not at the front, when they were on, rest and recreation, they'd go around photographing stuff, because they'd not been there before, and they acted like tourists. Again, wonderful collection of photographs. In terms of the fighting in North Africa, it's sometimes viewed as a gentleman's war. There were far fewer atrocities committed in North Africa. Prisoners were treated well. I think certainly Rommel and Montgomery, they almost had this sort of and terrible injuries. But they very much tried to conduct fighting there within the rule of law, in terms of international conventions on how fighting should be conducted. And also very, very fluid war. It's, I sometimes call it the seesaw war, because it kept going up and down or backwards and forwards. 1 minute the Axis would throw the British back, and the British would throw the Axis back. And they kept on doing that because every time anyone got to the end of their supply lines, they were short of petrol and ammunition. The other side would then launch a counteroffensive, and then they would be driven back, which is why the war just kept, dragging backwards and forwards along the coast of North Africa, through Libya and into Tunisia eventually, and obviously Algeria and Morocco when the Allies landed there with Operation Torch.
Let me ask you the last question, one more question about the last gamble of Hitler.
topic in military history circles. Again, that book is a follow up to The Devil's Bridge, actually, because it looks at the Battle of the Bulge, so Hitler's winter offensive of 1944, from the German perspective, because common sense, with the benefit of hindsight, dictates they should not have conducted that offensive. So I wanted to look at what the German generals thought of it at the time, and quite frankly, none of them were keen on it, apart from Hitler. They would have been much better off husbanding the armies that they'd so carefully rebuilt after Normandy to defend, the Rhine in the west, and then the Vistula and the Oder on the eastern fronts. But Hitler didn't want to do that. He wanted this grand gesture that would recapture Antwerp, drive a wedge between the British and the Americans. Antwerp, of course, was vital for getting supplies in, so he hoped that would slow down the Allied war effort. A similar thing with, with the Red Army, but that simply didn't happen, and nor really was it a possibility at the time. When you look at it closely, you can see actually it was a terrible waste of resources. It's called Hitler's last gamble for good reason. That Hitler threw the dice because he was convinced he could repeat what he'd done in 1940. When he'd invaded France and the Low Countries and brought them to their knees, because he'd done that through the Ardennes at that time. But of course, the conditions in 1940 were completely different to those in 1944.
Mr. Anthony Tucker Jones, historian, it has been a pleasure to talk to you about all of that. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your books as well.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.